Tēnā koutou katoa, kua tai mai nei tēnei wā. Greetings everyone. I'm Stuart McKinnon and I look after the institutional business at ANZ, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce and moderate this session. The theme of the session looks at the China-New Zealand relationship through a business lens, and as you can see, I'm joined by an excellent group of business leaders who collectively represent a significant portion of New Zealand's export sector, covering both goods and services. The sectors they represent include tourism, the primary sector and education, all of which we know well have a strong and important relationship with China and experienced significant growth prior to the pandemic. We're going to look at how these sectors have changed since early last year, how they've adapted, and with respect to, more particularly to tourism and education, how they're positioning for an environment where borders start reopening and demand returns. And of course, all of this with the backdrop that the Chinese economy is forecast to grow well above 8%. That's the ANZ Economist number. Rodney had a much larger number, and a lot of which is being driven by strong consumer spending. I'll now introduce our esteemed group of panellists. So starting at the far end, Jamie Tuuta. So Jamie wears a number of hats and he's a current and former director of a number of entities, many of which have a strong link to Māori business. He's also the chair of Tourism New Zealand and will share his views as New Zealand prepares for borders to open beyond the Trans-Tasman bubble and how we look to maximise and ensure tourism thrives as one of our leading export sectors. Next to Jamie, Lisa Lee. Lisa has lived in New Zealand for a number of years and 21 years ago set up the New Zealand operations of China Travel Services, one of the leading inbound travel operators that specialises in the Chinese business and tourist market. She is also active in Auckland's business and Chinese community and has served as Secretary General of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for the last 10 years. Lisa is well connected to China and will share her perspectives on the outlook and how New Zealand can and should position for greater border openings. In the middle, Paul Morgan. Paul is chair of Kono New Zealand, Nelson-based large food and beverage producer and exporter of premium wine, seafood, fruit and natural fruit bars. He's also a director of Wakatu Incorporation and has held many other directorships and roles within government and the public and private sector across many different areas. He'll share his reflections and insights on China, which is an important export market for Kono New Zealand. Next, Sirma Karapeeva. Sirma joined the Meat Industry Association in 2015 and was appointed Chief Executive in April last year. Prior to this, Sirma worked for MPI and before that MB, where she was active in trade policy, including progressing primary sector interests. The red meat sector has seen significant growth from China market in the last 5 years, and while there has been less disruptions from the pandemic, Sirma will share her thoughts on the outlook for the sector and continued important role China will play. And rounding out the panel, Professor Guy Littlefair. Guy is Pro Vice-Chancellor International and Dean of Faculty of Design and Creative Technologies at the Auckland University of Technology. Before his return to AUT in 2017, he held a number of senior roles at Deakin University in Australia and is internationally regarded as an authority in the field of manufacturing. Guy will have strong views on education more generally and foreign students more particularly. So in terms of the format, each speaker is going to talk for a few minutes and introduce their industry sector and business, and then we will have a Q&A. So I'd now like to welcome Jamie to kick us off. Thanks, Jamie.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, kei ngā maunga, kei ngā moana, tēnei te mihi a taranaki maunga, kia koutou katoa. Tā jau hau. I've got a few slides to take you through, and I wanted to start with pre-COVID. It was a wonderful time. So we welcomed almost 4 million global visitors to New Zealand each year. Total international visitor spend was over 17 billion, or 20.1% of New Zealand's total exports. China was a substantial part of this story as our second largest market by both arrivals and spend. Spend per day was the highest of any visitor market at $4,600, with the average holiday being about 10 days. There's no need to recount the journey we've been on since March 2020 to this audience. The tourism sector is in the process of rebuilding from zero, starting with a rejuvenated domestic market doing something new, and now quarantine-free travel from Australia, the Tasman bubble. While New Zealand and Australia are the markets we can convert to value right now, TNZ has continued marketing across our international portfolio to keep the brand alive for when borders can reopen, including China. China remains core to Tourism New Zealand's future strategy. The scale of our top three markets of Australia, China and the US is so significant that these markets will always play a critical part in tourism's recovery as part of a broader, diversified portfolio. Our focus in China since the border closure has been to keep brand alive in the hearts and minds of our consumers and trade partners. This is about priming the market to maintain and build New Zealand's brand position so that when the time is right, the market can be restarted. In China, our challenge is to emotionally connect with our target audience through two-way dialogue, so consumers feel like we are talking directly to them with bespoke content, so they continue to think about New Zealand even though booking a holiday is not possible at this time. You can see here some of the work, our trade work on the left, which covered 200 cities in China last year, and consumer campaigns on the right, keeping millions of consumers engaged with New Zealand, mostly through live stream activity. Our insights are telling us that the Chinese are ready to travel when it is safe to do so. You heard earlier that domestic travel has come back quickly, which is a sign of pent-up demand and an indicator of high willingness for outbound travel from China to other parts of the world. 87% of TNZ's target audience of 50 million consumers are keen to travel to New Zealand within 6 months of border opening. Those in their 30s or younger are showing higher resilience and desire to spend disposable income on travel. There is a trend towards health and wellness that already existed pre-pandemic, but we have seen this growing stronger. Countries like New Zealand with open spaces, low congestion, beautiful scenery are what our audience is looking for in the next international holiday. There is a trend towards health and wellness in their next holiday. And their preference is towards more self-guided trips, which is a trend that we've been seeing over time. So we expect strong demand from free independent travellers and smaller groups in the very near term. So keeping this audience primed and engaged is critical, and Tourism New Zealand will continue to find innovative ways of doing this. The panel has been asked to address the issue of value. What we think of value at TNZ is we say value is evolving. The sector has had a unique opportunity to reflect on the future of tourism and how New Zealanders want tourism to restart. For TNZ, at the heart of our strategy into 2025 is how we can influence tourism to enrich New Zealand by maximising the contribution of visitors against the 4 capitals that you see on this slide. Economic contribution, restoring nature for the intergenerational benefit of Aotearoa New Zealand, the tourism story enhancing our values and our culture as a country, as a nation, and jobs and social well-being. What you will hear us talking about more as we move into international recovery is our targeting of high-quality visitors. High-quality visitors. High-quality visitors are defined by more than the money they spend, but also the way that they contribute to our natural environment, culture, society, and economy. They are determined by the type of visitor, their scope of activities, travel across seasons and regions, environmental consciousness, and engagement with our local culture and local communities. The COVID experience is influencing more consumers, including in China, who want meaningful, sustainable, enriching holiday experiences. TNZ will be using a psychographic mindset approach to refine our target audience so that we achieve not just greater spend from markets through better targeting, but a more holistic value contribution from the benefit of both visitors experiencing Aotearoa New Zealand and, of course, New Zealanders as hosts who manaaki those visitors that come to our beautiful country. So this is where the future high value lies from our perspective, and it will be part of our approach to the China market and dialogue that we create with our audiences over the next period. It goes to the heart of the broad role that tourism plays across a bilateral relationship, both providing economic benefit, but also connecting people and place for the enrichment of two peoples, of two societies, and of course, two cultures. So we at Tourism New Zealand, and I'm sure the industry, the tourism industry, look forward to supporting that connection again soon. Nō reira, huri rau nei tō tātou piringa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora koutou te katoa. 大家好. It is my great pleasure to be on this part of this dynamic panel, sitting with Jamie, Guy, Paul, and Sirma. Guy, we're on the same boat, but I just noted that last week, U.S. announced the opening up to Chinese students by easing the travel ban. And Paul and Sirma, you're from the happy sector. I was glad to see that the trade of export to China reached over $13 billion last year, in spite of our education and the tourism sectors being severely impacted. As an international tourism business mainly involved in China market, we are the first to be hit by the pandemic. On 23rd January last year, on the Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year Eve, like many years before, I would give my staff a half day for celebrating it with their friends and families. I said to them on that afternoon that we will have a big challenge ahead, and our business will see a major disruption. However, we have experienced the SARS and GFC. Our business has turned out even stronger after this crisis. So as long as we work harder and smarter, we will be fine again this time. It turned out I was far too optimistic or naive. By the end of January, our revenue dropped 75%. When New Zealand closed the border to Chinese visitors on 3rd of February, our revenue dropped further 10%. When the border completely closed on 19th of March, our revenue dropped to zero, not 99%, as Greg mentioned. Knowing the situation in our industry finds itself in and the sacrifice required in this travel industry, we fully supported the government's call to protect the country with the health response plan we're undertaking. We strove to set an example, just like most of the team of 5 million during the lockdown. We knew the most important thing that would be to maintain the engagement with our customer base as well as the supply chain, which we have established for 20 years. No matter how tough the business environment was. In such, we did not happen it. We managed to commit the full refund to those cancellation caused by pandemic. We were inspired by our minister's reimagine tourism and participated in Tourism New Zealand's Doing Something New in New Zealand domestic tourism campaign. CTS has worked in the domestic ethnic Chinese market since our establishment 20 years ago. According to an independent survey in 2018, CTS was the most trusted brand in the domestic ethnic Chinese market. The survey also found that average ethnic Chinese spending on tourism, domestic tourism, was $219 per night, which is very similar to those international average spending of the international visitors, and significantly higher than the average domestic spending by Kiwi. In addition, the local Chinese act as a strong advocates of New Zealand tourism to their friends and families in China. In this past year, CTS created many new tour packages, such as our Chatham Island tours, maintained an active presence in the community, such as organize a travel exhibition on this Family Day event in this February. In particular, we retained a fresh thinking and a creative marketing team by using new platforms, including short video and live stream. However, even though we have pivoted to domestic business, it simply cannot sustain us. Pre-COVID, China was New Zealand's second largest tourism resource market with nearly 450,000 visitors a year. Chinese visitors spent 1.7 billion in 2019, which was 15% of all visitors spent. Since 1999, when China and New Zealand signed a approved destination status agreement, visitor numbers from China boomed. In the first 10 years, the market gained a rapid growth in volumes. But the yield was so poor that our inbound business was called chicken ribs, tasteless to eat and a waste to throw away. During the second 10 years, thanks to the increased direct air connectivity and the relaxed visa policies, Chinese tourism has shifted dramatically from the stereotyping shopping tours and to the high-value individual tours, and from a dual destination with Australia to the mono New Zealand destination. Chinese visitors no longer say, "I came and I see," but they say, "I came and I did." And in terms of the seasonal dispersal, Chinese visitors' performance was the best among all our international visitors. Across the whole sectors, such as the premier ADS groups tours, meeting and incentive tours, and the free independent tours, the average spending of Chinese visitors hit a record high year on year and was well ahead of our other tourism resource countries. Our concerted effort of value versus volume focus by TNZ and ourselves has been paying off. Prior to COVID, as a matter of fact, New Zealand was perceived as an expensive destination by Chinese visitors. With the visitor numbers become relatively static, and however, the value kept increasing, so we have been focused on the quality of experience to maintain our value for money position. What will the Chinese visitor market look like post-COVID? Research shows that the growth of tourism is aligned with the GDP, growth rate of GDP. Professor Song Haiyan from Hong Kong Polytechnic University study found that Chinese desire to travel to New Zealand has an income elasticity of demand of about 1. That means 1% increase of the GDP, China's GDP, leads to the 1% of increase of the arrivals from China to New Zealand. It is interesting, isn't it? First quarter to 2021, Chinese GDP growth of 18.3% resulted from quickly containing COVID is no doubt a good news to the recovery of domestic tourism industry in China. The BBC just announced a Forbes survey that Beijing has more billionaires than any other cities in the world. Chinese domestic tourism is on the track with a strong bounce back. And this May 1st Golden Week is predicted to be the busiest holiday period with record tourism bookings. The trend in consumer behavior of Chinese tourists is heavily impacted by the internet penetration and the urbanization of population. Chinese internet users reached over 900 million. By 2030, there will be 1 billion Chinese living in the cities, and half of them will be living in the 5 super city zones. Furthermore, according to the data analysis from both Stuart and Littlefair, millennials as well as GZ have become the main force of the tourists. With increased disposable income, this young travelers' consumption distributed on the tourism is unproportionately higher. Their budget on tourism is about 1/3 of their income. The population of GZ is more than 250 million people, and they are called digital natives, or the people of the screen. They rely on their mobile phone for sourcing information, making bookings, and most importantly, sharing their experience. To have a better understanding of the characteristics of the young Chinese travelers' consumption, future trend, and opportunities will be very sensible to our tourism recovery post-COVID. There's a very popular internet saying in China called plant grass, which means to grow the desire to purchase a particular product or experience. During last year, TNZ China team and ourselves had put a lot of efforts into planting grass in the minds of active considers in China. We should not miss the opportunity of reaping the fruits of the seeds that have been sown by working towards opening border with China as a priority. After all, China has enjoyed the similar success of the health crisis response, and both China Southern Airlines and the China Eastern Airlines, which never stopped their operation of passenger service to New Zealand, so far has not transported any single positive cases to New Zealand. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Te Pōkararo Mōkena, Paul Morgan's my name. It's very nice to be here with you this morning to share a few thoughts. I thought I'd be a little bit different and talk to you about the thinking in the boardroom, the model of Wakatu, Kornua, New Zealand, in Nelson, that little rural place in the South Island. I'm talking about thinking because we've had a lot of insight this morning. At the political level, we've had insight through our Prime Minister and past Prime Ministers. I've had the good fortune to be on a number of those visits and engaged with China over a number of years. Kornua, New Zealand is a food and beverage producer. You probably know that our most known brand in New Zealand is Tohu Wines. But we are a landowner, a water owner, and we started many years ago on a journey to integrate our business with a focus on securing customer and consumer relationships around the world. The other aspect to our business is that we're focused on how we can create intellectual property, knowledge, secure that for commercial benefit. So those are the two things in our minds when we discuss our future direction. Over the weekend, I've been reading the Productivity Commission's report, and I know you've all read it. You're business people. You engage with these discussions and these thinking documents. and it informs, hopefully, some of your decision making. The Productivity Commission has looked at New Zealand in terms of our productivity, and we're lagging globally against comparable countries, Singapore, Denmark, Sweden, tamir. And it's important we consider what they're saying, because it's discussing where we should put our effort and our investment at the government level, at business level, into our future, and where China, as an example, will play a part in that. We've heard this morning that China's a big market, it's the most important one for us. We've also heard that they're investing in the domestic economy, and they're moving towards all large economies where there's effectively, they're on a journey to 80% of their activity internally, like the US and the rest of them. So it's a big economy, and there's going to be more growth because more Chinese people are becoming middle class and they have discretionary income. Kōno New Zealand, we started our journey there 25 years ago in the lobster business. I loved it. Lobster, live, fresh, and very expensive. It's still that today, and it's had a journey, whether it be regulated, the nature of our customers, but Chinese people love lobster, they love banquets, they love family occasions and entertaining, and it's good for the lobster industry in New Zealand. It's the only market we export to. We've got 100% risk on that market. When COVID came along, we had a big tonnage in the market last February, a year ago, and of course we fell off the cliff. And we lost all our sales, and we had to have an arrangement with the government in terms of putting the catch, the production, into the next season. That worked well, and now we've had a spike. The last year we've had the greatest prices in the lobster industry in the history of the industry, because Australia has fell into a bad relationship and a supply and demand issue. As an example, we've heard in the debate this morning about diversification, specialisation. We are a diversified business that started in China 25 years ago. As part of that journey, we joined with the seafood industry, and we invested in administrative woofie a decade ago. We employed local people. On that journey, those companies have had a variety of strategies, and we now own the company, and it's a foreign woofie. We have our own food licensing in China. We have our own people there, and that's provided us with more resilience and more certainty in our relationship with our customers in China, because in little old Nelson, we're quite certain that we will have a long-term relationship with China. For Māori, we're comfortable with that. We come many millennia ago from Asia into the great diaspora of Polynesia in the Pacific, ended up here in Aotearoa, and we have the ability to engage relationship-wise effectively and quickly with our Chinese kin. So if you begin to get a picture of where we're going. With our investment and with our strategy in China, we're going to have to add a lot more value to what we send and export to China. It's either got to have IP wrapped around it, science wrapped around it, or it's got to be a product, services that we can secure greater value because we've invested in that. So for our company, we are investing in food science, science technology around human clinical trials for effectively food solutions to consumers. Now that requires a committed strategy, and it requires capital to invest. But what we're doing is really migrating New Zealand food offering into high-value ingredients, nutraceutical products, functional drinks, all of these things that we can secure greater value. Us being in China, and our general strategy is to be able to have customer-consumer relationships and find partners that we can do this business with. And that takes time and that takes money, and you've got to be committed to it. So when I look in terms of commentating, and it's once again, I'll take you back to the Productivity Commission's work, there's some very good visuals in there of thinking around business thinking, the role of government and where it invests our money in supporting business or otherwise. And a key area that business needs to look at is the actual research and development spend, the science spend of our government, and where it should lie going forward, and should it be strategically focused. We want that, and we've seen it, for instance, with, Zespri's relationship. They have a relationship with Plant and Food. They're some of the greatest people in the world to do plant varieties, and those one of them at the moment is very, very popular in China. It's called gold kiwi fruit. But there was a decade of investment in that. It doesn't come easily. So for us, China is a great opportunity. But we only put 20% of our sales into China. We could put 50, easily, probably more. New Zealand needs a diverse markets and relationships across the world, and we have a deliberate strategy to do that with our business. So, you know, it's not like the lobster business is part of us, but it's not a strategy I would run for the whole of my company. Not at all. It's the best market. We take the risk. It pays the most money. But to operate in one market, and it doesn't matter if it was China or you know, any other country in the world, is not a prudent approach in a volatile, uncertain world. Our business now in 2021 is more uncertain than it was a year ago. The main reason being is that we've got freight logistics issues for the country. We know that there's companies running short time. There's no cold storage. There's shipping issues. We're going to have to rethink the global logistics for us as a country because, you know, we can't just wait for the ships to turn up. We've got to move it out into the markets and make sure we can deliver to our customers and consumers. So, Kōno New Zealand, as Lisa said, we're the happy ones. We're happy we're moving forward, but most importantly for us, we haven't lost sight of the medium long-term strategy of how we're going to invest as a company and build our future, and China is a very important part of that, that opportunity going forward. So we do need to see, as I say, the partnerships, whether it's at business level or particularly our government level in research, science development, the technical transfer. China, they'll quickly be #1 in climate change management. They are quickly moving, but we don't realise they own 35% of electrical vehicles in the world, including garbage trucks and stuff that, you know, come by our doors using petrol and diesel and all the rest of it. They're converting quickly. So they've got the technologies and it's coming through, and we need that sort of relationship to improve our business's performance. So, kia ora, China. We're enjoying our journey with you all. Kia ora.
Well, good morning, everyone. And firstly, can I please say great thank you to Fran O'Sullivan and her team for pulling together this China Business Summit. We've had some excellent presentations, a lot of great thoughts and insights this morning, and I feel honoured and very humbled to be able to add my voice to that and to share some perspectives from the red meat industry. So I prepared a few slides, very short, and I'm going to keep these pretty high level and quick because I'm mindful that lunch is just around the corner and people are probably getting a little hungry. But anyway, just to give you a quick overview, the red meat sector industry, the MIA, we are an association, a voluntary trade association that represents 99% of domestic processing, exporting and marketing companies of sheep and beef meat internationally. We are the second largest export industry after dairy, and last year our exports hit $9.2 billion worth of export revenue. We're also the largest manufacturing employer. We employ about 25,000 direct employees, predominantly in the regions. And when we combine across the farm gate with our farmer colleagues, that number grows to 92,000 people that work directly and indirectly for the red meat sector industry. Collectively, we return about $12 billion worth of industry value to New Zealand, and if we take that down to a per household basis, it's about $3,300 for each household can be attributed one way or another to the red meat sector in New Zealand. So we are significant in terms of our economic contribution, but also in terms of our social contribution and our the value add that we can offer to New Zealand's regional economies and development. So far from being a sunset industry, as some might have accused us of in the past, the industry has certainly evolved and has adapted over the years to continue to meet customer demands around the globe. Unlike our historic beginnings, when we were exporting frozen sheep carcasses to Great Britain, today the sector has a very strong market and product diversification strategy in play, and this really played a pivotal role in the industry's ability to weather the headwinds of COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the ongoing challenges and disruptions over the past 18 months, the industry continues to perform for our farmers, our rural communities, and of course for New Zealand. 2020 was a good year for us. For the first time ever, in March 2020, our exports hit $1 billion, which is a record high for us. And at the end of the year, our total exports had grown on the previous 3 years, albeit by a small percentage, but nonetheless there was growth. China has, of course, been a key part to the sector's market diversification strategy for several decades. With the conclusion of the China-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, we saw a boom to our red meat exports to China. Our exports grew from $440 million to $3.2 billion today. Today, China is our largest single market for sheep meat, beef and co-products at $4.7 billion per year in export earnings. In 2019-20 year, China took about 54% of our total sheep meat exports by volume and 43% by value. The picture is very similar for our beef exports. In the 1920 year, China was once again our largest market, taking nearly 200,000 tonnes or $1.56 billion worth of beef exports. This was an increase by 14% by volume and 30% by value from the previous year. So this chart really highlights that dramatic growth since the signing of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement in 2010 onwards. So when we talk about China, we see it both as a high volume, but equally as a high value market. Currently, China is importing huge volumes of meat, largely due to the African swine fever having decimated its domestic pig population and reducing pork production and supply by at least 20 million tonnes in 2020. In order to secure the volumes of imports it needs, China is paying prices that are very high for red meat and for co-products. While prices for premium lamb cuts in China are not quite yet at the level that is being paid for those in traditional markets like the UK and Europe, prices for beef, particularly for our frozen cuts, are almost matching those returns that we're getting in other major markets such as the United States, Korea and Japan. Furthermore, because of the lower supplies of domestic pork over the last 2 years due to the African swine fever, Chinese consumers have had a greater exposure to other proteins and are likely to continue to eat high quantities of beef and lamb even when domestic pork production recovers. The international food consultancy firm JIRA is forecasting that while pork consumption will have largely recovered by 2025, consumption of all other proteins will continue to grow. So the fact remains that China's demand for protein is set to continue and to increase. And we've heard today about the 400 million middle class, and they certainly are driving this demand. The thing that we've seen throughout the pandemic is that consumer demand for more sophisticated products is also increasing. And New Zealand has a very good story to tell in terms of our high food safety standards, the way we've managed COVID-19 and implemented measures that have meant that there have been no COVID-19 transmission through our processing plants, the high quality of our product, and of course our natural free-range production systems. This speaks to Chinese consumers looking for safe food that is healthy and nutritious for themselves and their family. And this really is our key point of difference and the way that we can add value, real value, to Chinese consumers. The issue that we have is that while China continues to be a very important and growing market for us, it is also one which comes with a number of regulatory challenges which challenges our ability to fully meet consumer demands. Over the last 6 years or so, the Meat Industry Association has been investing in developing a relationship with counterpart organisations in China in an attempt to better understand the regulatory landscape and position ourselves to ensure we can comply and continue to export. COVID-19 has made this regulatory landscape even more challenging. Understandably, China is looking to protect its people from the impact of COVID-19 and, like New Zealand, is pursuing an elimination strategy. It is focused on keeping COVID-19 out of the country. The implication of this, however, is that exporters face complex regulations or guidelines that sometimes are hard to interpret and comply with, particularly as New Zealand has had no community transmissions for a while and has a clear alert level strategy to manage COVID-19 at different risk levels. For us, it is really important that our companies continue to have close and good relationships with their customers on the ground and are able to work collaboratively to navigate this complex regulatory environment. Our experience during the pandemic was that despite the disruptions and the lockdowns, the commercial relationships remained strong and supported our exports. And as an association, we have also been working hard to continue our collaborative efforts and have recently scoped out a meat hygiene cooperation program to share our knowledge and expertise to help China with its domestic sector developments. It is, however, challenging to take this cooperation program to the next stage through virtual engagement, as there's still a lot of hard work to be done to really develop common understandings and the trust necessary to support its implementation. And like many of you in the room, we're eagerly awaiting the day that we can travel again so that we can reconnect with our counterparts and really kick off this cooperation program as part of our re-engagement strategy with China. So I think I'll just stop here and leave more time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. I do have a few slides. Really the purpose of the slides are really to give the audience a little bit of an understanding around international education, and I'm particularly obviously today focusing on China. You may find it interesting for me to say that as an academic and a university leader, I've actually been doing business in China for over 20 years, and that's across 3 jurisdictions, in the UK, in Australia, and twice now in New Zealand. And when I was in Australia, I was responsible for signing the first joint Sino-Foreign engineering program for an Australian university, and I was part of Australia's largest ever trade mission that left the shores of Australia, and we went to China. 1,000 people representing various sectors travelled to China. So I've spent a significant amount of time in China and very much look forward to going back as soon as possible and re-engaging with our partners and continue to do that business that's very important to us. This may well come as a surprise to you in terms of exports and where international education ranks. This is international education which covers all international education, so it's not just a tertiary sector, it's not just a university sector, but overall. This only counts dollars in terms of revenue. This does not include the value of international education beyond the fees that are generated by students coming to study in our great universities and our great institutions. So we need to think about that in terms of adding on the value, in terms of the revenue that they spend with tourism, in our cafes, in our restaurants, travelling around New Zealand, and also the cost of travel backwards and forwards. These figures come from 2019, and in 2019 there were just over 18,000 tertiary students here, Chinese students here in New Zealand. 53% of those were studying bachelor's degrees, 49% were studying international master's degrees, and 19% doing doctoral degrees. Why would an international student or a student outside the shores of New Zealand choose to come to Aotearoa? All of our universities in New Zealand are ranked in the top 2%. In actual fact, half of our universities are ranked in the top 1% of universities in the world. I know of no other nation that can claim that. Our standard of education here is beyond world class. It is indeed world leading. And that is why so many international students look favourably upon New Zealand as a place to study. However, it goes beyond the provision of our education and the high standard of education. It's also about the attach rate, the numbers of students that stay here beyond their study and contribute to our economies. Also the number of students that go back to their home country as a consequence of studying at high levels of education here and become leaders in their own fields. And that connection between Aotearoa and other countries. And you can see when we rank against other countries across a number of different factors, our education is indeed very, very highly regarded. As all universities, AUT has a number of significant partnerships in China, and the purpose of this slide is not to talk about our own partnerships. But partnerships go beyond just writing research papers together. They include articulations, that is recognition of the study that Chinese students have done in their home country and how that can articulate into a qualification here. It's about exchange programs, how we can encourage our students here in New Zealand to travel to China and vice versa, and also the exchange of staff on sabbatical and research leave. It's also about engaging in research collaborations across our nations, and also there's a growing trend for teaching offshore, so that is New Zealand universities establishing campuses or study centres in China to deliver programs in that way. Universities used to judge themselves very much on the number of publications, and there was a phrase that was coined a few years ago, publish or perish. That is, if you no longer publish your research, you're probably going to perish. I think the situation has changed, and I believe that universities now need to have the mantra of partner or perish. And partnerships from an international student perspective are very, very deep, and they're very, very broad. We don't just influence or have interaction with the individual students. We have interactions with their institutions they've come from, with their high schools. We have interactions with their parents. We also have interactions with their government agencies. And conversely, here in New Zealand, as a consequence of international education, our international students and overseas institutions are touched by many of our industries, many of our governments, many of our NGOs here in New Zealand. We also pride ourselves as a country of sending students overseas as part of their study, And China has grown in its popularity. These are some figures, I believe, similarly from 2019. You'll see that, and this is for the whole of the New Zealand sector, you'll see that China now ranks as number 3rd as the destination country for students studying here, going overseas for an overseas experience. And my last slide, I'm sure our moderator will be pleased to know. I often talk about knowledge diplomacy or soft diplomacy with respect to education. International education is incredibly important to New Zealand. It's incredibly important to China. We very much welcome the opportunity to engage with China, and once the border does open, the whole sector here in New Zealand has some very interesting and courageous and creative ideas of how to engage further. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you all the panellists. Now we are close on time's up, but it would be good to get a couple of questions. So can we get the ones up here? Because I'd probably rather your questions than ones I've. So we might just start right at the top. How important is Te Ao Māori to differentiate New Zealand products experiences in China? Perhaps a quick word from Jamie. Paul?
Given Paul's my older cousin, I would usually defer to him. But I think this really goes back to people-to-people connection. You know, we as Māori have our origins in Asia. We have similar perspectives in terms of an intergenerational perspective, and we deeply value relationships. And so I think that's a really good platform by which to enable that, how we convert those relationships into some meaningful value that contributes to the well-being of our country, which is broader than just economic value. And I think, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that, you know, relationships with countries and people such as the Chinese add value to the social and cultural fabric of our nation. And certainly when you look at the demographic of our country, it becomes vitally important, and I heard the Prime Minister say this morning, in a pluralistic society, to be welcoming and accepting of other cultures and perspectives in our nation.
Yeah, I think, you know, Jamie, it's a very important this discussion because, you know, I'm a member of the New Zealand-China Council, and just recently we were talking about Kiwis' attitudes to Chinese Asian people, reflecting on the fact that, you know, the first Chinese came here a very long time ago and have been part of our country, and we've had recent waves of migration from Asia and the great diversity of culture, language, connectivity that's provided our country. So there's some quite ignorant, lack of education attitudes in the community. And from my perspective, it's incumbent upon the government to ensure we up the cultural engagement, the education of New Zealanders to understand their diversity, because it's our reality, and we need to be informed, educated people.
Can I add two examples that Whanua Tonga, the family value is highly respected by Chinese, and they deeply touched by our Kiwi hospitality, that you came as a visitor and leave as a whānau. And another example of Kitiak Tonga, the guardian of the nature, which this Maori legacy, I think, is the heart of our beautiful natural heritage. And that is the reason why we are able to raise the tens of thousands of dollars from our Chinese visitors to the yellow eye penguin breeding project.
Look, thanks everyone. Time is up, but I want to thank the panellists. It was excellent insight into your businesses, your industries. You're all passionate about it, and you're all having to work and be challenged and adapt. So well done. Thanks for presenting. Thanks for joining us today, and please join me in thanking the panel.
Kia ora.